Hello, everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of Irenicast. Today, we're going to be putting up the second part to our interview with Brandy Daniels from Tuesday. If you haven't heard the first part, you can go check that out in our iTunes feed, or you can go to irenicast.com/28. So, without any further ado, here's the second part of our interview with Brandy Daniels. So from Duke, then what? So you ended up at Vanderbilt eventually. So how was that transition? And did you go there? What were you going there for? Like what was kind of taking you to that next step?
After my first master's, I was still, or during my, like towards the end of my first master's, I was still like, I don't know if I could do this. I don't know if I want to do this, all of those things, but was interested in it. And then applied just to like one small program and realized, this is not the way to go about this because a PhD is a long time and, wanted a solid advisor that I knew would be a good fit for me and a program that would be a good fit for me. And I knew what I didn't want. I would have loved to, there were some of the faculty at Duke that I would have loved to still work with, but was like, can't be here. And part of it too was doctoral programs are a crapshoot to get into. There was a colleague of mine who is now a doctoral student at SMU, who's brilliant, smarter than me, hands down, better student than me in all the ways. But I got into a program that year and he didn't, in part because it's just, you have to be at the right place at the right time, like with the right people. So I was just like, all right, I'll try my hand at this and see what happens. And it worked out. And Vanderbilt and Union Seminary were my top choices. And I got into both and for some reason decided Nashville instead of New York, which I'm glad I did. I'm glad I went to Vanderbilt for a host of different reasons, even though Union is awesome. And then I figured, heck, now that I'm dissertating, I'll move to New York and hang out with Union people. I don't know if I answered your question. I don't even remember what your question was. Sorry.
No, that's good. So when you got to Vanderbilt, did you immediately start a PhD program or?
I did. I started, yeah. And I went to Vanderbilt for, a host of different reasons and the financial package, I've been in school for a lot of years now. And finally I'm getting paid to be in school. It's kind of not much at all, but I'm getting paid to be in school. So that's good. And they have this program, this fellowship program in theology and practice that I thought was really important and a sort of a way to sort of think faith alongside theory that I really valued and wanted to be a part of, and got into that. And so, I just went into Vanderbilt and kind of started at it. And, there are a lot of like ups and downs in that process too, but sort of just kind of trudging along through the long process of going through coursework and then figuring out my questions. Like there's this great comic about like PhD work and it's like the PhD and there's this like huge circle of like what you're interested in studying. And then there's a bigger circle that's like the world, and then there's a smaller circle and then it like zooms into that smaller circle and smaller circle and smaller circle and smaller circle. And then like a little tiny pinpoint. And it's like what you're doing. So it takes a couple years to figure that out. And, and then there's like a slightly bigger circle that's like your interests and how they all connect and, and then another point in that circle become book number 2 or whatnot. So just a 4-year process sort of, and, after being in classes for however many years, it was like 2 more years of classes and then having to pass exams, which comprehensive exams is just sort of like, do you know the field of, so I had to, read and learn everything, some of which I'd already known, some of which, I had to go back to, some of which I had to learn anew, like fresh, everything from, we had 3 area exams, one in doctrine, one in history, and one in method. And so, I had to read a lot of Hegel. That was fun. And a lot of, and I'm being facetious there, everyone from like Hegel and Hume and Kant to Gregory of Nyssa and to Sally McFaig and Shelley Rambo to, it was all over the place depending on, to Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and sort of, had to acquire basic competencies so I could say, I am a doctor of, God willing, hopefully someday soon, a doctor of, in Christian theology. So I know the sort of the canon. And then after passing languages, which that was, technically I'm proficient in reading German and French. Yeah, that's funny. Um, then it was sort of like, okay, write about your which it's obviously a little more guided than that, but not much. And so now I'm dissertating, and that project became more and more clear as I tried to figure out what I wanted to write about specifically. And it's still not entirely clear. A lot of people joke that the dissertation is kind of like a baby. And it's, I have yet to fully give birth to it. It's gestating. People joke that it's like a baby or like a process of like a short marriage of, meeting each other, getting together. Like, yeah, there's some funny comics. PhD comics is hilarious. And they make those kind of jokes a lot. But I'm still trying to kind of give birth, so to speak, to, or grow inside of me, give the nutrients to give birth to the like baby that will eventually become my first book, which will be my dissertation.
So for people listening that maybe aren't too familiar with kind of that process. So like you said, essentially the first part of your PhD program is to make sure, you know what you're talking about on a base level. And then you get into a specialty and you basically write about that specialty, right? And you end up.
One thing I'll say about the like people not knowing about that process, like that's so common, even for people in the academy. Like when I was starting in my program, it's sort of like, what is this process like? And there's this like weird shroud of mystery over like what the steps are. In part, like, because people don't think about, oh yeah, they haven't done this yet, so they don't know. So it's this sort of like kind of figuring it out as you go in this weird sort of way. And and I've been lucky to have like great people in my life and great advisors and mentors who have been like, here's what's next. But there's a lot of like trial and error of like, oh wait, what's happening next? Like how do I study for comps? Like, so I just have a year, you give me this book list and I have a year to learn it. Like, what is that? How do I do that? Like things like that. And so, yeah, but basically it's like you take classes to broad knowledge in the field. You make sure you know enough about that field to where your program can tell you that you're competent enough to teach it someday. And then you begin to craft, dissertating is sort of beginning to craft your own contribution to that field. It's the dissertation is seen as original research. So like saying something that has yet to be said in theology that takes into account what's already been said and what am I arguing with what's already been said and do I have support for that?
So basically the dissertation process is you have to write a book on something that no one's really written a book about?
Correct.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, hey, that's easy, right? No problem.
Exactly. No one's written about it yet, right? So
I know. Who's going to tell you no?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. I wish it was that. Yeah.
So are you able to share like what you're currently writing about? Like what is your dissertation on?
Yeah. So I don't quite have my elevator speech down. So we'll see how well I do with this. Well, I'm pulling up my abstract in case that might help me ramble less. Can I just read my abstract and then?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, because that'll be better than me rambling. It'll make more sense.
Okay.
I promise. So my dissertation explores the topics of spiritual formation and theological method and their relation to one another by examining how we think about, live within, and relate to time and space. And I place theological analyses of time and space, which I see as eschatology and anthropology, in conversation with queer theoretical reflections on these themes, which are understood in sort of the disciplines of queer temporality and anti-sociality, which that's a whole, but yeah. So my sort of thrust of it, and now I'm going to stop kind of,
Yeah,
I just needed that to help get me started.
I didn't understand any of that.
Basically, I'm looking at a trend I see, and I was like, oh, that's actually not helpful. Thought it would be for a minute. Because there's so many, I feel like my dissertation has a lot of moving parts, so it gets complicated.
For sure, definitely.
But I see a trend in theology that I think is good, and it's that we put how we do theology and how we live together. Like how we live should affect how we speak about God and vice versa. Wild concept, right? And I think that's important. And there's been a lot of work lately, and by lately meaning in like the last like 25 years, that seeks to do this. Two of the ones that I'm focusing on most specifically are Stanley Hauerwas, who is a Duke theologian, now emeritus, who's pretty kind of big in the evangelical world in terms of theologians, and Sarah Coakley, who is a feminist theologian, though that's a whole other conversation. But they both have these projects that kind of want to see like how we theologize affecting how we live and vice versa. I'm saying that's a good goal, but the way in which they do that respectively is really problematic, I'm arguing, because they operate with what I'm calling a telos of success, that they have this vision of what the good looks like in such a way that actually renders their projects internally inconsistent, because it delimits possibility for a lot of different reasons, but it delimits possibilities of what like formation can be and the different forms it can take. So it puts problematic boundaries on theological imagination. It also, my biggest kind of beef with it from a theological point of view is I argue that it doesn't sort of take, this is kind of humorous in light of a joke you made earlier. It doesn't take the fact that we're fallen seriously enough in terms of like the limits on our humanity because of being, not only being fallen, but being human. Bonhoeffer talks about it as we exist in the middle, or our creaturely existence of, we're not God, so we don't have all the answers. But I argue that they have this sort of vision of the answer and what it looks like that doesn't take eschatology or anthropology into account. And the eschatology, study of the last things, but it's sort of like the sort of big sort of catchphrase in eschatology is the already not yet. And I argue that like, especially Hauerwas spends a lot of time on the already, but not the not yet. And so what does it mean to think of ethics and to think of theological method with that not yet in mind? Does that mean we try to work to that yet? Or does that mean we just embrace not being there? And I use queer theory, particularly some theoretical work on how we think about and conceptualize time and space to kind of raise those questions and point to a different possibility. And one of my biggest critiques too in this sort of teleology of success is that both of their projects kind of speak to community in a way that actually I think puts kind of weird and problematic limits on community and belonging. And so trying to rethink belonging and connection that doesn't have those same kind of limits, if that's even possible. Time shall tell.
So let me try to, I'm going to go through that in my mind. Let me see if I can figure out. So basically what you're saying is you're kind of writing about the idea that too many theologians, their theories and structures are, even when it comes to practical, ethics or whatever, are so structured that they don't take into account the complexities and nuances and gaps in humanity, in people, and communities.
In a way, yeah, and that they're, in a way, I think that's a big part of it, and that in light of that, they sort of, have these conceptuals. I think structured is a good word for it, but it's not even for lack of nuance. It's just these assumptions about because they don't look at this question about like the fallenness of our humanity or just the humanityness of our humanity. We don't even have to use the language of the fall. I mean, Bonhoeffer does, but the theologians I use to kind of critique this in addition to the theory are Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Reinhold Niebuhr, which is kind of ironic because they are not in the same camp at all. But I argue that they both sort of had this robust sense of what it means to be human that takes into account limits and failure and flaws and all these things that offer better possibilities for seeking, quote, the good life, whatever that means. Does that make any more sense?
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. That's really good. So what is are you, now that you're kind of in this process and you've kind of walked through this journey of academia and kind of a personal journey as well as where you fit in all of that, do you have a better sense of kind of where you're headed and what you want to do with your work ultimately?
Yeah. I mean, I want to keep doing what I'm doing. Really. I love it. And I've discovered as time and time goes on that I love writing and I'm decent at it, at least decent enough to have done this much of it. And I like teaching and I kind of just want to keep doing that, and that, after getting the PhD, it's, hopefully, God willing, maybe someday getting a job, the market that we, yay, capitalism. Yeah. But the job market in the academy, especially in religion, in all of the humanities is pretty rough. So, and it's becoming more and more rough with the rise of adjunct labor, and there are huge issues with all of that. But ideally, I want to teach and write at an institution, teach other div students and stuff like that.
That's fantastic. So kind of in maybe I don't know if this is a good place to wrap up. So we talked a little bit earlier about this idea of you had some kind of spirituality that was driving you in certain ways, and through that process, kind of through your academic process, how did that spirituality express itself? Like, for instance, did you regularly attend church, or were you part of faith communities? Like, or would you say that the academia itself was kind of your spirituality and your expression of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a large part of it is that academia has been a sort of a huge component of it. And part of, amusingly, to like loop back to the actual things I'm writing on is, part of what I'm critiquing in my dissertation, particularly in the work of Stanley Hauerwas, is he has this sort of idea of like this big difference between church and world of, this is the mission of the church is to be the church, he talks about. And I think that's laudable, but part of what I'm critiquing is this assumption about, well, how exactly do we separate church and world? Like, where is that line? Like, what constitutes church? Why, and there are theological reasons, and it's complex in terms, then that gets into ecclesiology, blah, blah, blah. But like, why is it automatically assumed that like me chilling at a bar with some friends is not church? And what possibilities and new forms of relating and belonging and community and self-formation do we foreclose when we don't even have those possibilities on the horizon? But like, because I think one of the things is like, what's been surprising to me is like, I've found hope, whatever that is. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, in part because of some of the work I do kind of critique certain notions of hope, and new avenues for spirituality in places I never expected to find them. And so what does that mean? And I've kind of stumbled upon those ways, but what might it mean to kind of open up greater possibilities for those ways, not institutionally per se, but to sort of name that, if that makes any sense. I've experienced and encountered spiritual growth and formation and whatever, those kind of weighted words through experiences and avenues that I never would have considered avenues for that and didn't realize until in hindsight, I'm like, oh yeah, like that was a form of like church for me. And like different aspects of my work kind of explore that in different ways. I just published a paper on how using Eastern Orthodox theology to argue that sex is a form of prayer, particularly in the losing of the self that happens through the acts of both, and how Eastern Orthodox conceptions of like deification of what prayer is and does, of ecstasis, has some interesting overlap with some sort of theoretical discourse by this dude Lacan, so psychoanalysis, and some queer kind of users of Lacan. How they talk about sex is super similar to how Eastern Orthodox people talk about prayer. What could it mean to see sex as a form of prayer? What does it mean to like? And then in light of that, like in hindsight, people could say, oh yeah, sex can be prayer, but what does it mean to like take that seriously, to have that frame how we think about formation per se, which doesn't mean like make something of, like go into sex thinking, oh, prayer, but that's part of what makes it so formative. I guess like paying attention to the way certain things form us in ways that can be good. And then also looking more closely at the ways things form us in bad ways, but that we don't even notice.
So kind of in the sense that we tend to compartmentalize these things and don't realize that there's a lot of interconnectivity in our spirituality where we can experience these things not in settings that we're used to.
Right. And so what does it mean to like try to take that seriously, but also, and this is where it gets kind of confusing, but also not to expect something from those things in terms of like, of seeing sort of spirituality or different formative experiences as being in like the sort of excess of in places and times and encounters that we don't expect it, or those moments where you're like so involved with something you lose yourself, right? Whether that's sex, there's a academic word. Oh well, yeah, no, not I don't have to go into talking about jouissance, but like basically like orgasm in French means like little death. So like the loss of the self, and thinking about like, some of the conventions that I went to in high school and youth ministry, and the Pentecostal moment of like those intense emotional experiences, like hands are, those kinds of things, of like that there's something powerful in that, because it's sort of like a abandoning of the self just for a moment, or people with art or whatnot. So what does it mean to sort of foster that kind of formation? And see, this is where I'm rambling in ways that are kind of circular of, kind of, because one of the other key components of that is, which I kind of alluded to briefly earlier, is like looking at ways in which the ways we're formed limit us, and how that's like, that just happens. And that's part of, and you guys have talked about this on the show some with different guests you've had, of how kind of queer theory and certain strands of gender theory like the ways we've been formed put certain boxes around experiences that can be beneficial, but that can also limit. So what does it mean to try to look for small ways outside of those limits? Which doesn't mean that those limits aren't still there. They're always there in some way, shape, or form. But to kind of find, it's a totally 100% different kind of God in the gaps theory of like finding God in those places you don't expect, or finding yourself in the places you don't expect, because that's where you lose yourself. I'm not making any sense.
No, it makes sense. And then taking into account, hindsight, where you have that moment, and in the moment it means something, but when you look back on it or remember it, it means something different because of where you are. And
then that gets into complicated things. It's like, is that memory good or bad? Like narrative, there's this whole debate about narrative. Is narrative a useful tool, or is it a problematic tool that limits in terms of put certain norms on experiences that don't necessarily need to be there? Yeah, that was my like terrible attempt to try to distill like Foucault 101 on knowledge and power in like 2 sentences, and it failed miserably. But yeah, sorry.
No worries. I mean, obviously, I think if you're dealing with theology and in particular people, it's going to be complicated, and there's going to be too many ways to explain certain things because you have different perspectives and different people giving their opinion and thoughts on things over the years. And I think complicated is a good word, and I think that maybe we're just not comfortable with being complicated, and that's part of it, is that being able to sit and rest in complications is a difficult thing.
Yeah, and articulating complicatedness is hard.
Yeah. Very hard. We've run into that a few times on the show, trying to articulate ourselves. Thank God for post-production.
Awesome.
Well, I guess I'm sure there's so many other things we can talk about, but I think that kind of covers it. Thank you so much for coming on the show and kind of sharing your story and a little bit about what you're doing with your work.
Thanks for having me.
Is there any place where someone who's listening, they'd be interested to kind of follow you to find out when you release new papers, or do you have a blog, or kind of plug yourself a little bit here?
Oh gosh. I don't know. I mean, you could Google me. I have like an academia.edu page, and I have a website, but I don't have it like functioning. But I have a website I have like a personal website that I don't. But yeah, the Vanderbilt webpage. Also, I blog. I haven't been for a while, but I'm supposed to be more soon, for this great blog. And I say the great part because of all the other authors, Women in Theology. And it's a group of women in theology. It's pretty self-explanatory, but some great feminist theologians, junior theologians doing some awesome work, and just kind of who do some awesome work, just kind of doing the blogging thing and reflecting theologically and feministly on different, things that interest them at particular times or whatnot. It started as a group of Catholic women, and then it grew, and there's now a handful of us from different religious traditions, but all sort of in theology, broadly speaking. And
so if someone goes to that website, they can kind of search your name and find different things you've written. All right.
womenintheology.org.
We'll put stuff on the show notes for those of you that are interested to go check those out. And then we'll also, we'll put a bunch of stuff on the show notes telling you a little bit more about Brandy and her work and things that she's written. So once again, thank you so much for coming. And if this is a positive experience for you, we'd love to have you on and join all of us maybe for an episode on a certain topic that you might be very helpful for us in understanding.
Anytime.
Well, that is it for our interview with Brandy Daniels. If you'd like to make any specific comments about this particular part of the interview, you can do that at irenicast.com/28.5. That's 28.5. And there you can also see different informational links to go a little bit deeper on some of the things that she may have discussed. And don't forget to join us on Tuesday for our regularly scheduled program. If you like what you hear, you can support us by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe. And you can contact us anytime at our feedback page at irenicast.com/feedback. So for this week, I'm Jeff, and thanks for joining the conversation.